So my name is Maria Redden, and I'm the Chief of Staff at Two Bit Circus.
Two Bit Circus. What type of company is that?
So Two Bit Circus started off as engineering, art consulting shop, right? So if you needed something like a game or a spectacle or an interactive experience, you could come to us, and we would design it and build it and run it for you.
Would you describe a typical day at your job?
Sure. Every day is a little bit different, right? Because we are, at this moment, we're about 100 days from open. We are finishing up our games. So everything from tying up bugs that we may find from our QA team to making sure that game art is really tight, that the instructions are really easily understood, to the actual physical construction. So we have a fabrication team as well that does it on site. Another part of my job is, how do we think about kids and families? How do we think about schools sort of when they come? How do we think about corporations and want to do team building? How do we think about beta users? So just how do we think about all the different users that will come to our park, and how do we engage them?
So what is your favorite part of your job?
Over the past year and a half, we've built a really fantastic team to deliver on the vision. They are a strong blend of creativity and, for example, for our fabrication team. The head of fabrication worked at the Museum of Natural History for 7 years. He was the one that built a lot of those exhibits that you see out there. Anything from programming the dinosaur puppets that they would have, all the way to sort of creating interactive pieces at the museum. He's part artist and part fabricator. We have our game designers. One of them, for example, has her own Twitch channel, and she hosts it, and she gets the audience to play along with her. Everybody who's here has a combination of multiple skills. There's never a meeting where another good idea doesn't come up. If anything, part of what I feel my job is prioritizing the ideas, right? Because we have so many of them, and the question is in finite amount of time. So a lot of it's just like, all right, we'll do these first, and these we'll push till after we open the park, and then we'll revisit these.
Well, when you were young, what did you dream of becoming?
I still am to this day at my heart an engineer. I always wanted to be an engineer. My dad was one, and him and I would build a lot of things together. Legos or things out of cardboard or things out of Tinker Toys. And so I just always knew that I wanted to build things.
So who was or is the biggest influence in your life?
It was absolutely my dad. So I grew up in Ecuador, and my dad told me this funny story about how he was working for the government, and the government had purchased the first computer that was going to go into Ecuador. And so he told me that he had read the entire manual before he even saw the computer. And so this is a time when there were punch cards. So he actually made the punch cards for the computer to take in. My dad had like a stack of punch cards for something that he wanted it to do.
So what are your most vivid childhood memories of school?
I loved science when I was in school. I remember my science teacher. This is a silly example, but I remember my science teacher was talking about how cream turns into whipped cream and then ultimately butter. And so she had this glass jar with cream inside of it, and then she had put some marbles in it. She shook it, and eventually, she shook it so hard that the marbles actually sort of burst the glass container, and everything went sort of out. But the fascinating part was that the cream had started to turn into butter, and so the butter was all over the ground. But I remember all of us were on the ground, so trying not to touch the glass, but you could see the butter.
Yeah.
Right? And we were like, oh my God, that's butter. But it was really amazing. None of us believed her at the beginning, and there it was at the very end. So,
what do you wish you had known going into college?
Going into college, I feel like there are things that are practical, that sometimes you don't necessarily, that college doesn't necessarily force you into. So, for example, I came across a class. One of my computer science classes actually, and the professor made us do a presentation in front of the entire class. I don't like public speaking very much, especially back then. I was just like, nope, do not want to do this. and our class is of 120 people, but we have to do this. And what the professor said is, he said, this is not for your engineering degree, because you will have to give presentations about your work many times in your career, and you need to be able to speak coherently about your work. I always think back on that class because I really didn't want to do it. I ended up doing it. It wasn't as horrible as I thought it was going to be. And it was so useful to be able to just kind of do that little thing. And I remember thinking like, nope, I could do this before. I can probably do this again. Basically, how do you communicate with the rest of the planet who may not be as excited about this, about these topics as you may be, or as I was certainly.
So what advice would you give students who think they might want to enter a STEM career?
One of the things that I learned was that STEM is very broad, broader than you imagine. When I started school, right, like I loved programming, so I enjoyed it. But because I wasn't the best, and because there were so many people that were so much better than I was, it made me a little bit discouraged. And I thought, you know what, like, this is going to be hard, right? Like, I'm never going to be as good as they are. And so, and when I left school, what I realized is, what I understood is that I didn't need to be the best programmer ever, but my ability to understand sort of how programmers worked allowed me to be a really effective program manager, and ultimately a manager in beyond. So what I realized is I didn't need to be discouraged in terms of not being the best programmer out there. All I needed to do is really understand what engineering was about. Maybe I wasn't going to be that engineer that wrote that amazing piece of code, but it was fine, because sort of you need people like that, but you also need people who track everything else, that create the larger piece, that connect with the rest of the company. This field is broad in their space for all kinds of different talents.
Yeah, have you personally experienced barriers that have affected your STEM career?
One of the things that I had to learn to work through was communicating with older engineers. So my first job out of school was at Mattel, and where I was part of a team that created new technology for toys. And it was a lot of fun. We made all kinds of crazy things. But Mattel also had engineers that were easily, 20 to 30 years older than I was. And they had been doing this for a lot longer. In that case, it's a combination of being able to understand, their perspective and how it is that they think about you, sort of coming in with less experience, but perhaps more updated knowledge. It took a little while to navigate that.
How important has mentorship been in your career? Really
important. I've been one of my bosses at Mattel. His name was David Keeler, and he was amazing. He's the one that taught me how to deal with people. And he taught me sort of how to understand teams, how to understand groups, how to help them move through things that may be issues. That part is really hard. It was really hard for me. He was really instrumental in helping me work through that.
Why is it important to establish and encourage an environment which fills the STEM careers with diverse individuals?
Oh my gosh, diversity is so key, right? Because it comes down to points of views and having the strongest idea emerge. Like, the point of view comes from your lived experience, right? Like, so, I'm now a mom of a 7-year-old. And so my perspective is very different from designers here who, just got out of school. How do you bring all those different perspectives to bear on your product? Definitely. Also, culture is super important, right? As I mentioned, I come from Ecuador, so my culture is very much about family, and, the extended family is really important, right? Which is very different, often, certainly not at odds, but it's sometimes very different from like a mainstream American culture that tends to have more of an atomic family feel. Again, right? Like, it's about bringing all those perspectives to bear.